buzzing through the walls, making their honey and singing their song. They say I work for the queen all day. Yeah, I work for the queen all day.
Hello, the Queen Bee's Hive. This is Angela, and here I am with our next first take, finally, right? On chapters 50 to 58 of Go Tell the Bees That I Am Gone. I know this was a long time coming. I do apologize for it. Between having to do the live last weekend on Sunday, that kind of took me up until Monday, and then I'm having a few issues here at home that I'm dealing with at the same time. Plus, this section was very intense and difficult to take notes, to break down. I kept trying to edit it down. So this may go a little longer, just a little bit of a warning. I don't know, as I'm just starting to record it now. So I don't know what it's going to be, but I'm kind of guessing that it's going to probably run closer toward the 2 hour mark, like an hour and 45 minutes. So we'll see how we do. Whatever it is, hopefully you guys will enjoy it and get a few nuggets. There are going to be a lot more nuggets when we get to the deep dive. So this is definitely a light touch compared to what we're going to have to get into with these chapters, because a couple of them could have easily been a 2 hour discussion minimum on just that one chapter. They have a lot in them, most especially chapters 54 and 58. We are back on the ridge for this whole section, and while it was a downshift in pace, there were certainly some incredible turns, definitely some character life altering moments in this very strong character and relationship section. The Murrays, including Jenny, are now leaving as well. The ridge is with the Macks have already gone, and now the Murrays are going on this very long, dangerous trip through the areas of war into the Mohawk areas to check on Emily and her kids after a massacre occurred, and they don't know whether she survived, who survived, if the kids are orphaned, or what the story is. Rachel finds out that Ian likely has another son by Emily. She gets that little piece of nugget of information, as well as Jenny finding out and Jamie finding out. All of these people find out that piece of information. And I have to say, Rachel handled this entire thing amazingly well. I was so impressed with her. A lot of really great relationship moments here between all of the characters, and I really feel like that was the big strong focus here, is bonding of these relationships. The Macks leave, and Roger finds out about Bree's heart. Like, all of these secrets are uncovered and things are revealed, between characters, which automatically bonds people. And the two most momentous life-altering moments, holy moly, in this section, where Claire's blue light healing power emerges as she brings a stillborn child back to life in an incredibly emotional chapter. The faith echoes throughout, had me a little teary reading that chapter, and also kind of makes one spiral into some speculation, because healing is one thing, bringing a stillborn back from to life is another, and has, like, okay, what does this mean kind of connotations when you look back, and what, knowing Master Raymond was around with faith, it starts to make your wheels spin in that. Also, the other big moment was Jamie and Jenny having a heart-to-heart as Jamie relives and finally remembers the details of Culloden, Murtaugh's death, and learns with the shock at the very end that his sister plans to leave with Ian on this very dangerous trip. We also get a lot of ominous vibes, very ominous vibes about Jenny at the end, which is a little too ominous in my opinion, and I have a bit of an idea of what Diana is doing with that now that I've seen a pattern developing with this, and I will explain that more when we get there. So this first take covers 9 chapters. All the chapters take place on the ridge, with the minor exception of one that has the Macks when they just left the ridge and they're on the road, but pretty much it's all of those characters. These chapters include Sunday Dinner in Salem, Wheels Within Wheels, ripe for harvest, first foot, moon rise, the venom of the north wind, thee would make a good friend, ready for anything, and telling beads. So let's get started on this whopper impacting section. I gave these chapters a 4.9 honeypots. They were slow, but they were strong. A couple that were very table setting, type chapters, but a lot of great character and relationship moments, excellent writing, no blaring errors. These chapters end this section in ways that kind of set up the next section, the Journey of 1,000 Miles, which is next. So those things nudge up my rating. I would say that 3 or 4 of these chapters were probably solid 5 chapters. With the Murrays heading one way on a quest, the Macs heading another way on a quest. So Diana really gave us, I think, all of this relationship and depth before all of these stories start spiraling off in different directions. And these huge, big moments that we've been waiting for, Moonrise for Claire and Telling Beads for Jamie, are 2 big chapters, both with revelations and personal character growth and change for each of those 2 characters separately, as well as together. We also get some really wonderful recontextualizing of the past. From the Abbey ransom of Jamie's soul to Culloden to Ian, see Ian Sr., Brian, and Murtaugh. I mean, there's so much that's recontextualized and informed of previous books and so forth. And I really enjoyed that. And I'm going to talk a little more on that as we go when we get to the writing wrap up of this part. So my good is all of the relationship cultivation and deepening, which to me is a key in Diana's writing, is the strong relationships and characters she builds. Each chapter really demonstrates a strength, each single one demonstrates a strengthening bond between 2 people, or a trust or experience shared. Here are some that we'll point up along the way. We see Roger and Jamie being more strengthened and bonded, Roger and Bree, Jamie and Claire, Ian and Rachel, Rachel and Jenny, Ian and Jenny, Jenny and Jamie. All of these relationships get a boost and grow even more over these chapters, because when you share a trust with somebody, it deepens that relationship. When you let somebody in a little further and you kind of take down another little wall of secrecy or understanding between you, that's kind of a block, it kind of deepens that bond. And you see that happening with all of these relationships in these chapters. Relationships are a key strength of Diana's writing, and I love that even now in book 9, with relationships we've seen since book 1, she is continuing to build those relationships and bond those relationships and change them, which is quite a difficult thing to do at this stage of a book series. My bad, I didn't have much bad. My one was that, we had no Lord John and William or anything in this long stretch, of chapters. But that's not really bad. I mean, it just worked out that those were the chapters I picked. So I also picked, for my bad, was Aaron Cloudtree picking up poor Agnes off the floor and then smacking her in the face like that, when this poor girl's been traversing the entire night by herself through woods, through treaty lines. It's this little 13, 14-year-old girl by herself at night just to try to save her mother. These people are really into smacking people in the face in this book, aren't they? Really kind of made me cringe when that happened. I kind of, I don't like all the face smacking going on here. My grade, well, I'd say it's a tie. It's Claire coming into her power. Her roots of her hair are now white. The writing of that chapter really was a triumph. It was really very heart-wrenching, exquisite, made you think and question things. It set up things for the future. I love that Jamie shared that entire experience with Claire. He's present, he's active and part of it. My personal theory is that his energy contributed, because remember, Claire is an empath. So that involves absorbing energy as well as funneling it out. I believe that she utilized Jamie's strength in that. So I think he was part of it. So they're a team again. When it's always great when Jamie and Claire do things as a team, especially when it comes to medical things. I like when Jamie joins in with her on that. We have a lot to explore on that chapter. We're not going to be able to do as much as I'd like to, and we'll do in the deep dive when we get there. But the writing of that chapter alone earns it a great. Add to that the momentous marking of a change in Claire. How could it not be a great? Second, I thought that the telling beads chapter in some ways was even better, probably was better. It was so rich, so beautiful, enlightened the mystery, and recontextualized such a momentous part of this saga, the Battle of Culloden. I mean, that's like a set piece that everything kind of revolves around. So to have that recontextualized, defined a little more, some of that mystery removed, that's a major step in this book. Additionally, it was a truly lovely look at the relationship of Jenny and Jamie. And really, that chapter shined a light on every period of this saga at some point in time in that chapter, including what's to come in the prequel. So, in a way, the way I look at it, it's kind of like Moonrise enlighten the future and telling bees enlighten the past, both in very major ways. So I really love those two chapters, and I think they were both really great for the purpose they served. A couple comments from other bees before we get started. My first one's from Janine Whistler. She says, lots of big moments in this section. Firstly, we've been wondering how Claire would manifest her destiny, by either saving a loved family member or by healing Roger's impossibly damaged throat. But Diana exquisitely brings back faith for both Claire and Jamie in such a loving way, so emotional, such a perfect way to demonstrate how love is the root of Claire's power. So that's why we've been having all the faith memories. Faith is the catalyst that Claire needed to tap into her healing. So you think that's the only purpose for all the faith talk, was just this chapter? We'll see if we get her mentioned anymore after this. We finally get some clarity about Culloden, Murtagh, BJR, and Jamie. I hope it brings Jamie some sort of peace, because he's going to be very busy with the war soon. I can see Bree and Roger getting back before the conflict begins, but the Murrays, I don't know. I have a little bit of foreshadowing for Jenny. It felt like such a goodbye between Jamie and Jenny. So, Janine, I love what you said there, that love is the root of Claire's power. I like that. What a beautiful way to put that. And that love for faith and the desperation to bring her back. I believe that was like the very push and strength that brought this child back. On Jenny, I agree that it does seem very foreboding, especially her having all of these meaningful talks with everyone before she leaves, and then making plans for her rosary in case she doesn't come back. But I kind of believe that's a misdirect by Diana. I do see a pattern forming there. And when we get to that chapter, I'll explain that a little bit more. As we start our first chapter, 50, Sunday Dinner in Salem, let me share another piece of feedback from Tiffany Henschel this time. And then I'll have one more comment from one of you when I get to the end to kind of wrap us. On this chapter, Tiffany says, I love the growth that we see in Jamie and Roger's story arc in this chapter. In A Breath of Snow and Ashes, Jamie didn't really want to talk to Roger about events to come in the future. But here, Jamie is seeking him out. In this chapter, he asked specifically for Roger to talk to Francis Marion so he can gain insight into forming his own militia. He also asks about Frank, a most vulnerable topic for him. This could have never happened a few years ago. Yes, Tiffany, I love the bonding demonstrated here and the thoughts shared between them and the nod to the fusing of this one-mindedness between Jamie and Roger, which we've kind of watched Diana crafting this really since Echo on a different level than what she had before. I don't think I personally agree with you on how far apart they were in A Breath of Snow and Ashes. I don't think I see it as far apart as you do, because in that book, Jamie had great trust and love and bonding with Roger, even at that point. And yes, it did unnerve him sometimes to talk to Roger because of the type of things they would talk about. The type of things that Roger would tell him were always such hard truths. And compared to what Brianna and Claire would tell him, which was more fanciful things with inventions, roads, trains, planes, all of these types of things that didn't really make a difference for him. But when he would talk to Roger, Roger would have this cold certainty about things that were going to happen, and it would kind of unnerve him. But he still talked to him, and he still went to him for advice on all those things. It just wasn't fun conversations like he'd have with Brianna and Claire. That's the way I read it. But he still always went to Roger and consulted with him about what he knew about different things and so forth when he needed to know. But you do see the evidence in this conversation of their deepening bond on another level. And part of that, I think, is the result of the heart-to-heart they had when Roger revealed the things he knew, and it kind of laid Jamie bare to Roger. Jamie, I mean, at this point, like, why not talk about Frank? What's Frank compared to what happened with BJR and Wentworth? Like, once you've crossed that line, pretty much you don't have to have any shame in your game or nerves about anything at that point. And talking to Roger about Frank is a benefit compared to Claire and Bree, because Roger wouldn't have the bias that Claire and Bree would have. Plus, Roger was also a 20th century historian and would know how that world works. Anyway, I think that trout fishing in America really added another dimension to their relationship. So we open this chapter with Roger preparing to leave soon, and securing this hoop on this horrific smelling barrel that he's rebuilt with a false bottom, hiding like a layer of gold. And Jamie comes up with more smelly crocks filled with cabbage. What follows is this wonderful chapter featuring Roger and Jamie, which is always a good thing in my book. I love the Roger-Jamie relationship. Jamie pitches in and helps Roger and notes that between this fishy smelling barrel, his cabbage, and the other barrels that once held salt pork and blood sausage, he says, "You'll smell like Sunday dinner in Salem," which is how we get the title. I love how much pride Roger feels at Jamie's approval and praise of his work, which was, according to Jamie, braw and sound as a nut, Roger Mac. And so, yes, Roger does actually have some competence despite the show's portrayal of him as some useless, wimpy academic, but I digress. As the scene progresses, you begin to see this symbiotic relationship between them emerge. The way they each sense each other's thoughts and movements, the more intense combined Mac mojo between them. You saw this form between them in book 6, as I said, this kind of natural connectivity. But since his return, Diana is really hitting that idea harder. Remember when we discussed Echo, we saw him frequently feeling Jamie's spirit beside him, guiding him. And we talked about that Diana was developing Roger to be Jamie's new Ian type relationship, to have that type of bond. And you see that here, this mutual mind at work, this straight talk and advice between them, the ability to sense what the other's thinking. Roger notes that while he shares thoughts with Bree and Claire sometimes, it happens much more often with Jamie. And we see Jamie talking in a much more rational way. This is another thing I wanted to talk about. A much more rational way about Lord John. He says his past should protect them on their journey, but make sure you run at the least sign of trouble. And that in Savannah, even though an attempted siege is planned according to Frank, which we'll get into next, it won't be successful, but the family will be safe under Lord John's protection. And so a little piece of that conversation, Roger says, so the Americans are going to what? Lay siege to Savannah? So he says, Randall, but they will not succeed. There was something odd in Jamie's voice every time he said that name. No wonder if there was. But Roger couldn't say exactly what it was. Not doubt, not hate, not quite fear. You think it's safe, though, for Bree and the kids to be in Savannah while all this is going on? Jamie shrugged and picked up his discarded jacket. The American militia will not take the town, and Brianna will be under Lord John Grey's protection inside it. And you trust him, Lord John, I mean. It wasn't a question, and Jamie didn't answer it, but asked another, do you trust Randall? So this is interesting. Note the very dismissive, cavalier attitude that Jamie has about this attempted siege happening with his daughter and grandchildren there. He obviously does trust John's word and ability to protect them. He doesn't have any tone of rancor at all, and the only time he makes like an uncomfortable face, according to Roger, is at the mention of Frank in his book, which most of us understand based on Diana's launch, but it hasn't come out yet on the page. Does this mean that now, Jamie's all of a sudden okay with John? No, not quite. But he does trust John, whether he admits it or not, because he would not be so okay if he didn't trust him. We don't see the attitude, I think, because he's talking to Roger, not Claire. And I saw some discussion on the chapter thread on this. I agree with Selima's very thoughtful analysis. I always love her comments. And here is what she said. She said, as far as the differences in behavior when talking to Claire about John versus when he's talking to Roger, when he's with Roger, he's calm and rational, using his upstairs brain. When the subject of John arises, especially with Claire, Jamie quite literally flips his lid and defaults straight downstairs to animal brain, completely bypassing logic and rationality. Truth, Selima. That's all I can say. Truth preach, sister. Anyway, so Jamie has come to Roger with another purpose, though. First, he gives Roger some instruction, and we find out he wrote a letter to Fergus in a cipher, which I think is pretty cool. Roger is to see what Fergus has planned. Jamie doesn't think it'll be too dangerous because Fergus is now a father of 5, not as reckless as he used to be. But when he gets to Savannah, there is a soldier called Francis Marion. I'm going to be doing a separate post on Francis Marion, that according to Claire is known as the Swamp Fox in Roger's time. Roger says he's heard of him. Jamie explains that he had a letter last week from someone who had spoken to Marion, who said that General Lincoln plans to take a stab at taking Savannah. So this is what he says. Jamie's eyes were fixed firmly on a puddle of the sauerkraut juice. And Roger thinks, okay, so here's the slippery bit. So you see the way he's so in sync at reading Jamie, even though Roger is gifted that way anyway at reading people. It came out in a rush. Jan Randall said in his book that the Americans would attack Savannah in October this year. He added with a direct look at Roger. The Americans will not succeed, but Marion will be there. And you want me to talk to him? If you would. The thing is, Marion's had a great deal of experience with militias. Like you haven't? Roger said. Amusement flicked across Jamie's face, but he shook his head. I haven't had experience in lending a militia I've gathered and command to the Continental Army. Marion's done that several times, and from what the letter says, I want to Ken if he has any sage advice with regard to dealing with certain officers. Who's a bastard and who's not, you mean? That would be a help, but will you likely have a choice? All officers are bastards, Jamie said dryly. They have to be. So am I. Some you can trust, though, and some you can't. And from what I hear, Marion is one to trust. I see, Roger says, but then he thinks. And you want a friend in the army before you go to him, a man that can help you test the waters before you commit yourself, or maybe to warn you off. So you see how Roger is just kind of seeing what's hidden underneath of what Jamie is actually saying. That's your choice, isn't it, Roger continued, whether to commit our militia to fight with the army or to go it alone like Cleveland and Shelby. Jamie explains to Roger that they're not alone. They each have each other's back if they needed. Each man gets to keep his own command, though. And he says that doesn't happen, like in the army. So Jamie explains what the actual choice is: to either keep the militia close to protect the ridge, or to go join the army in battle against the British. And he says, once we know that, we can make a plan. So Roger contemplates that, and he says, so, you to act or not to act? Then he says to Jamie, smiling, and I love this, get on with ya. You couldn't stay out of a fight if someone paid you to do it. And Jamie had the grace to laugh at that, though he looked self-conscious. Now, knowing what Jamie has seen in the book explains all these little looks on Jamie's face. Once we find that out and you go back and look at this. He says, but there is Captain Cunningham. He might get his guns one of these days, and then what? And Roger agrees that would be bad, but he can't imagine that he would attack his neighbors because he lives here. So Roger asks about the Savannah siege attempt, as I already read, and Jamie assures him that Randall says they won't succeed and they'll have John's protection. And we see Jamie in this very weird position, if you think about it, to have to trust Claire's other two hubbies in this situation. He has to trust Randall's word that the Americans won't succeed and John's assurance of protection. And he's putting his entire family in the hands of these two former husbands of Claire's that are basically people that get under his skin. So I kind of love the conflict, the inner conflict of that. Roger notes something odd in Jamie every time he says the Randall name. I personally think when he says not exactly doubt, not hate, not quite fear, I'm thinking it's worry, and it's with an annoyance that he's worried. So when Jamie asked if Roger trusts Randall's information, Roger very clearly says yes, regarding historical information. And he explains that everyone, historians and academics, would know the facts of the history, and that Frank would never misconstrue that, not only because it would ruin his own reputation and accuracy and all of that, but academic publishers wouldn't publish it. They check academic books before they publish it. Now, this is all foreign ground to Jamie. Remember this. Like, you didn't have publishers and all of this rules and the way things were done like they are now. Roger's present. You didn't have that in place back then. It was basically the printer was the publisher. So it's all foreign ground to Jamie, what Roger's saying, but he trusts Roger. So we end with this last look at Roger and Jamie. They stood a little in silence, watching the storm come in. Roger would find Francis Marion, and God willing, Fergus would have guns. But Roger found his thoughts sliding away from the hard decisions and slippery realities toward his own more imminent personal prospects. He was wondering whether Bree might possibly be pregnant, and if so, how she might respond to the smell of Sunday dinner in Salem. Now, this tells you a couple things. Not only tells you that he has picked up that something is off with Bree, in spite of her trying to hide this from him, but also very nicely transitions into the next chapter, which Diana has done spectacularly through these chapters. She has put in transitions almost every single chapter into the next chapter so that this entire section smoothly flows right through. So our next chapter is chapter 51, Wheels Within Wheels, and it's alternating in Bree and Roger's POV. And we pick back up with Roger and Bree and the kids. They're on their way, and as some things never change, their wagon breaks down, right? The wagon wheel is stuck in the middle of the creek, and Roger is just in his shirt, and he has his rolled up briefs, and he has to deal with going into this cold creek to try to pull out this wheel that's stuck. And Brianna says it's too deep and the breeks need to come off too. And I'm already liking this chapter. The breeks come off, and with the wind fluttering his shirt, it gives little peeks of his sweet booty, as he makes his way into the cold water to wrestle with the wheel. And now I'm even liking it even better with the little picturing that. So Roger asks Bree, what was it your mom said to your dad about this expedition? And Bree's answer is very interesting. She says, what she said to Dad, or what she quoted herself as having said, which isn't necessarily the same thing, was, you're telling me that you mean to turn a perfectly respectable Presbyterian minister into a gun runner and sent him in a wagon full of dodgy gold and illegal whiskey to buy a load of guns from an unknown smuggler in company with your daughter and 3 of your grandchildren? Now, I like that because not only was it a funny line, but it clearly lays out the situation, like boils it down to one little paragraph to understand what's happening now. It lays out the dangers very simply up front. But also, Diana is using Bree here to say that the way Claire says something was said or done may be a little skewed, and it kind of reiterates to people what she's always telling people off page, that Claire's POV is not always objective. You can't always trust everything she says as 100% accurate, her recollection or her take of what she said per se, because it's skewed by her own hang-ups or thoughts or irritations or whatever. So I find that interesting because I see Diana doing things like this all through here, putting things that she has told people on the page, which we'll talk about at the end. And Roger says, "Aye, that's the bit. I was expecting it to be more fun." Maybe I shouldn't have brought you and the kids. Maybe Jermaine and I would have had a great adventure by ourselves. And Bree says, "Yes, that's what I was afraid of." So I think Claire's words, putting it so bluntly like that, has Roger a little worried about bringing his wife and kids into this whole caper. This chapter really once again highlights how much the experiences of the last 2 books have strengthened and bonded Roger and Bree. You don't appreciate what you have until you lose it, they say, right? And I just sense the Macs are now not about wasting time on petty stuff. Their bond is very tight right now. They were, it's not that they weren't bonded before. They were. They definitely were. But now they've matured and grown in that bond. And they have an attitude that, you know what, all the rest of the stuff doesn't matter. What matters is us and our family most. And you really see Diana highlighting this whenever we see the Max on page in this book. The kids are off collecting firewood, and while Bree is listening for any issues with them and watching glimpses of Roger's ass and thinking about how to fix the wheel, she starts to have another heart episode and says, "I don't have time for this," out of frustration. And Roger hears her and says, "Time for what?" And she tries to blow it off. She starts, and nothing, she gives him some bullshit excuse. And so then she starts doing the exercises her mom taught her, putting her head between her knees. This is not great, Bob. And it helps a little bit at first. And suddenly the wheel comes loose. Roger slips and falls on his, on his one knee, and all the water comes rushing up his shirt. And he curses, and Bree laughs, and she starts to curl up her skirts, wade in, and together, teamwork, like a Jamie Claire type of thing. Together, they get the wheel out. And I think it's an analogy of what's to come with the other complicated wheel, which is her heart. In this chapter, she needs to team with Roger as well to accomplish the task of dealing with this situation. It only really worked when they were working as a team. And so I think that's going to be kind of like an analogy. The situation with the wheel is kind of an analogy to what's going to come later with her heart. They both sit, but the exertion has resurged Bree's condition. And Roger is immediately alarmed looking at her as she tries to say she's all right. But Roger can see this is BS. She is not okay. So he's like hell you are. You're white as milk. Here, put your head between your knees. So she resists his push on the back of her neck, waving him off. No, it's okay. Just felt a little faint for a minute. Probably low blood sugar. We haven't eaten anything since breakfast. He took his hand away slowly, and he's looking at her with intense concern as she realizes she has to tell him. She says, "Roger, I have to tell you something." He stared at her, frowning a little. Then suddenly his face changed. A light came into his eyes, a dawning sense of eagerness. "You're pregnant! God, Bree, that's wonderful." Oh boy, does the man not learn from what happened the last time we had a conversation like this? It was so funny because we were just talking about this scene showing up in season 6 with Mrs. Bug in our thing on Sunday in our live. It was like, so kind of kismet that we were covering this chapter. So she snarls, you, how effing dare you? And Roger knows, oh crap, I just effed up. But the entire thing resolves very quickly. And it shows both that they have so much more maturity than they used to. It shows us that both of them have so much more maturity than they used to. You don't see no storming off. You don't see the whole thing escalating. She doesn't emasculate him. He doesn't avoid her. She doesn't cover her vulnerability with being brash for a long time. All these were patterns of their past in their relationship. And that's kind of all simmered away. Roger's eyes sprang wide and he grabbed her arm. I'm sorry, he said, low voice and even. Tell me what's wrong. She struggled for a moment, wanting the simple release of violence, but he wouldn't let go, and she stopped and sat there, tears spurting as the only means of releasing the pressure. He let go her arm, put his own arm around her shoulders. She clung to Roger's arm as though it were a handy tree root in a flood. I love that picture. So she's crying and she's trying not to cry. And Roger's being patient, trying to give her space, trying to let her gather herself to talk, being patient. And she's like going, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. He's rubbing her back. And he says, no, I'm sorry. He said into her hair. Bree, forgive me. I didn't mean to. I really didn't mean to. And she goes, no, it's not you. I know you want another baby. He says, not if you don't. He assured her, though she could hear the longing in his voice. I wouldn't risk you, Bree, if you're afraid. And she says, oh God, and she waved a hand to stop him. So she begins to tell him what a heart is supposed to sound like. And he's confused, but he's trying to be patient with her. And she tells him to put his pants on. She'll tell him everything. Mandy says they're hungry. Roger says he'll go and deal with it and he'll be right back. And by the time he's back with some food, she's working on the wheel and just starts to give him this mechanical report. And Roger was not playing games. So he's been probably beside himself the whole time while he's settling and feeding the kids. So he's like, to hell with the wheel. He says, eat an egg and tell me what's going on. And it says his face showed nothing but concern, but the set of his shoulders said he wouldn't leave it alone. So she told him. So here we get, like I said, this deeper bonding of Roger and Bree. She is finally sharing the struggle and all its dangers with her soulmate. And now they will be a team facing this challenge with her health as well. He asks if she has the willow bark tea. Of course, Claire gave her a boatload of willow bark tea. She tells him the stroke possibility and that pregnancy can make it better or worse. And she shares her fears about possibly having passed something to Mandy. And he puts her at ease. He remains very calm and soothing. And they talk about what happened with Buck, the impact of the stones, and discuss the possibility that maybe it gets worse each time. So they're kind of still trying to kind of figure how things go. And then we get this really lovely bit. She says, don't worry, Mama said the odds of someone my age and my state of health having a stroke were infinitesimal. As for pregnancy, he said, Bree. He stood and pulled her to her feet, facing him. I meant it, Maveness. I'll never risk your health, your life, or your happiness. He tilted his head so they were forehead to forehead, eye to eye, and he felt her smile. Do you not know how much you mean to me? Let alone the kids. For that matter, do you really think I'd risk you dying and leaving me with those wee fiends? She laughed, though he could see the tears still glimmering in the corner of her eyes. She squeezed his hands hard and let go, dug for a handkerchief. Maveness, she asked. I don't know what that one means. What does it mean? Joy, he said gruffly, and cleared his throat. My joy. He nodded at the wheel on its sprung tire. What is it they say? Happiness is someone who can mend ye when you're broken. Oh, isn't that beautiful? It's very, he's like a chip off the old Jamie Block right there with like his little smooth lines. So then the POV changes to Roger. They've mended the wheel, the real one and the metaphoric one, and they now are on the road again. And after 2 hours, Roger starts to doze while driving, and Bree tells him to get in the back, but he can't bring himself to leave her side. And he lets her drive, but he stays up there, grabs a bite, asks what else she brought. She says tools, books, gifts, and we find out that Mandy wanted to bring green eggs and ham, but that would be dangerous. And Roger internally expresses some worry about the cultural impact of the future impacting the past. And he wonders, like, starts to almost feel like are the time police going to come get them or something? And we find out that Bree and Claire have been duplicating all the Dr. Seuss books, remembering the words with Bree drawing the pictures. And he asks offhand, what if a printer sees it and wants to publish it? Which then gets them into a talk about the idea of historical friction. And I think this convo may be a third wheel in the wheel of complications of the future affecting the past. She says, historical friction, there are all kinds of things, ideas, machines, tools, whatever, that discovered more than once. Mama said the hypodermic needle was independently invented by at least 3 different people all around the same time in different countries. But other things are invented or discovered and they just sit. No one uses them, or they're lost and then found again for years, centuries sometimes, until something happens and suddenly it's the right time. And whatever it is comes suddenly into its own and spreads in its common knowledge. Besides, she added, practically nudging the bag with her foot, what harm could it do to loose a bastardized version of Cat in the Hat on the 18th century? He laughed in spite of his uneasiness. No one would print that one, a story showing children deliberately disobedient to their mother and not suffering dire consequences for it. Like I said, not the right time for a book like that, she said. It just wouldn't stick. Now, this is interesting because all of this talk connects 2 things. What Diana said was a big theme of this book is the idea of cultural elements from the future leaking into the past. The idea of remnants of what people know from the future, whether you're trying to hide it or not, ends up pouring out and having an effect. Second, this conversation creates a transitional thread between this chapter and a lot of what's coming in the upcoming chapters. The idea of one time period leaking into another. You're seeing this theme all woven through this book, which is something Diana mentioned to me when we messaged, hence the recurring out of time music mentions. We talked about that. Lastly, they speak of Fanny and Jane, and we find out that Bree plans to paint a permanent portrait of Jane for Fanny, which I think will be really special for Fanny. I hope the Frasers can frame it and put it somewhere visible for her to show Fanny that Jane matters to them too. And in the process, Bree tells Roger more details of the story and Willie's involvement. She says, poor Willie too. I don't know if he was in love with Jane or just felt responsible for her. But Mama said he showed up at her funeral in Savannah looking awful with that huge horse he gave to Dad, the horse for Fanny. He's already given Fanny to him to take care of, and then he just left. And they haven't heard anything about him since. Roger nodded, but there wasn't much to say. He met William, 9th Earl of Ellesmere, once several years ago for roughly 3 minutes on a quay in Wilmington. A teenager then, tall, thin as a rail, and with a striking resemblance to Bree, though he was dark-haired, but with a lot more confidence and bearing than he'd have expected from someone that age. He supposed that was one of the perquisites of being born, at least theoretically, to hereditary aristocracy. You really did think the world, or a good part of it, belonged to you. So I really think this whole bit of conversation is likely some foreshadowing. First of all, again, we're getting another view of a past situation, okay, from another perspective. But it's also likely some foreshadowing for what's coming for Willie and Bree. Based on the daily lines we've seen, we know he comes to see her at the Brumbies. And putting it together with the talk of Jane's portrait may mean that he sees her working on it, you know, when he's at the Brumbies. If we know now she's going to be painting this portrait there, which if he happens to come visit her while this portrait is up and about, and he's kind of sees it when he comes to see her, it's going to freak him right the hell out. You know, just knowing how he felt when he saw the house down the street that she was kept in freaked him out, a little bit. I mean, imagine him just coming in, first seeing his sister, which is going to freak him out, and then like turning and seeing on an easel a picture of Jane that she painted. I think it would just totally freak him out. And I'm kind of feeling like putting those two things together in this section about, right next to each other like that, about her painting the portrait for Jane and then the conversation about Willie. It kind of makes me think that may be foreshadowing that those things will join up in the future. And remember I said last time how, now Jane has become important to Roger too after he went through that experience with her picture. Well, this ends with Roger talking about going to say a prayer at her grave. How sweet is he? And Bree, very touched, says she will join him, ask John where it is, and they can go together so she can make a sketch. And this is the last that we see Max in this section. This is the last view of them. So we'll see where we pick up with them next time. Next, chapter 52, Ripe for the Harvest. It's in Claire's POV and opens with a letter from Benjamin Cleveland inviting Jamie to join his militia to go through the area and harass and dislodge loyalists. And Claire asks Jamie, what are our choices? Jamie says he likes her saying our because he will need her to stitch up his limbs back together. What else is new? He's going to end up looking like Frankenstein by the time this whole freaking series is done with all of his scars. His choices are one, ignore the letter, which he's already done once, which he doesn't really want to do as it might put his own loyalties in question, especially after the Monmouth adventure, which that whole thing gets rehashed a bit. Then, or two, send a letter back saying that his own local loyalists, he has them to contend with here and can't leave them here to wreak havoc on the ridge, which is true. But he doesn't want that to be common knowledge. He doesn't want to risk, one, Cleveland coming there to support him and then causing more issues. And he doesn't want to put it in writing in case it gets to the wrong hands or in the papers or somehow puts a target on the ridge. So he opts for option 3, which is to send a bottle of the 2-year whiskey to Cleveland and the other leaders saying the barley has just been cut and he can't leave or there won't be whiskey next year. So when in doubt, whiskey solves the problem, right? So a couple weeks later, the barley is cut and we hear the grueling work on the ridge, especially for Jamie, who does all the harvest work with the other men. Eats, sleeps for an hour, gets back up, drills and trains the militia with Bobby. I guess being a former soldier, has its benefits for Bobby. Until the very last slice of light was gone, then he'd sleep and get up at dawn before dawn all over the next day, and do the whole thing all over again. He paid each man that showed up a silver shilling to seal the bargain. He hopes that by the time everyone has come sporadically by mid to late October, after the harvest, he might have horses and rifles for them. So this was more of kind of an expository chapter, kind of let you know what this month has entailed, that Jamie's kind of finessing the line with Cleveland, raising a militia, and the workings of the harvest. Next chapter, First Foot, we get a timestamp, which I've been desperately wanting, and it's September 16th. And the Frasers have now closed their solid oak door for the first time on this date. And Bobby and the boys are there both to celebrate and keep Fanny company, who's missing Jem, Janet, Jermaine, and Mandy very much. Oh, so sad. So over dinner, they make bets on who will be the first knock on the door. And the next day is when the first knock finally comes. And we get a mention right before that of Claire stirring her cauldron and thinking of the Macbeth witches right before the knock comes. And I kind of think that being that it ends up being Hiram Crombie, who's the leader of the Fisher folk that think Claire is a witch, it's kind of like a nod to that, a little foreshadowing that it's going to be somebody from that ilk that comes. So it's Hiram Crombie. He's decked in his finest studs. He's formally asking for a private word with Jamie. Off they go to the study, and Claire goes to mess around in her surgery. Now, on first blight, the part in the surgery felt a little tedious, which it was. Claire is looking in her Merck manual for modern treatment of interstitial cystitis, which I looked up. It's a condition that causes severe bladder pain and lower abdominal pain. Does this matter? Will it come up later? I don't know. Or is it just for color? I don't know. One thing I did notice, though, buried in the fluff of this sleepy little bit with Claire, is again a focus on things around the one time period impacting another. We get 4 mentions of that in this little part with Claire and her surgery. First, we get the special chair that Jamie made for her with the rock maple rockers, which she says will last for generations to come. So, will we see this in the future as some like heirloom of the past, of Claire's past, being used down the road? Like, that kind of feels like an intentional mention of multiple generations in the future. Second is the manual, which she thinks, beyond curiosity though, there was somehow great comfort in the sense of authority in the book, the feeling that there was someone, many someones, who had blazed a trail for me. I wasn't completely alone in the daily struggle between life and death. And she remembers her training, so that's like another thing. She remembers her training manual, being a nurse in the war, and the whole bit from it on safe water and spring water not always being clean, etc. And she thinks about the third mention. I should copy that out in my own case book, I thought, glancing toward the big black book on the shelf above the leech jars. It was a comforting thought that someday that case book, too, might give a sense of authority to another physician, arming them with the gift of my own experience, my own knowledge. And then a little later, we get the fourth mention, some talk about malaria and how Lizzie was doing. She says, who would read my writings, I wondered. Not only the case book, but the small book of domestic medicine that I had published in Edinburgh 2 years before. Now, for the record, I firmly believe that Frank got a hold of one of those little books that she published, especially if one was in each of the 3 boxes they sent, because I believe he got one of those boxes. Will her case book be found in the future too? And she goes to this whole litany of the kind of stuff that's included in the case book, which was not something you'd read in that time. Germ theory and drawing pictures of bacteria and penicillin. So it's interesting how you're getting all of this repeated idea right after we got to talk about the historical friction thing. But you see this theme is all through. And the bit with Claire and her surgery is kind of the idea of that culture of one period impacting another and shifting the thoughts of another person that reads it or sees it, and times and cultures bleeding into each other. And for me, that was really Diana's purpose in this scene, is to kind of show that in just their daily lives. So now Jamie comes in, says Hiram wants to set up his half-brother Cyrus, who's nicknamed Tall Tree, to officially call on Fanny. And Claire is alarmed. And she's like, she's freaking 12, You can't seriously be thinking of setting her up to marry the Crombies. And Jamie says Hiram, understands that they're both too young for anything like a formal courtship or marriage. But his real purpose is just to create an appearance of a tie between the families. And we find out that Cunningham is really hard stirring the loyalist sentiment in his services, which I do not like or trust that situation at all. I still don't. Although Jamie tells Claire that he doesn't think Cleveland is starting his own loyalist militia. If Granger or Partland come with one, Cleveland will support and enlist support for them. So some of Hiram's people are stirred up, and he wants to have a visible link, so it's clear that he's with Jamie. And Claire asks why a pack of rock-ribbed Presbyterians are even listening to a Methodist anyway, for entertainment? And Jamie says, mostly. The captain's no so good as a Punch and Judy show, or even as good as Roger Mac, but he's something to listen to and talk about. And Hiram's cousins have been talking, and he does not like it. So it's another little nod to the Lord John books there, because in Scottish Prisoner, we saw Jamie saw a Punch and Judy show in Hyde Park to calm himself down after storming out of Hal Gray's house. So I like that, another little nod we get. Jamie says he won't let Cyrus come around if Fanny isn't okay with it. He doesn't want her to feel uneasy in any way, and he will talk to her. He wants Claire to talk to her. And then he says Cyrus is a sweet-tempered lad, and Hiram paid him a big compliment because he says he thinks like a fish. And I have no idea what the hell that even means. Does anybody know what that means? He thinks like a fish. And how that's a compliment, I don't know. Boy, I'm getting a terrible glare on my camera. Sorry about that. I'm kind of in the sun right here. When approached, Fanny is very cool about the whole thing. Although she says he doesn't speak much English, she says she is trying to learn Gaelic. She doesn't know much yet, but maybe she'll learn more from Cyrus. So she says it's a good thing. And then she says, besides, a shadow crossing her face, with Germain and Jemmy gone, Cyrus will be someone to talk to, whether he understands me or not. Oh, she's so sweet. She misses them so much. So bringing up Germain made Claire remember Fanny's indecent proposal, so to speak, to Germain. And Claire's worried. And I could totally understand that, because if Cyrus makes an improper move on her, she might feel obligated, especially knowing that the Frasers are setting it up and came and asked her. She might feel like that's what's expected of her. And Cyrus, being a 15-year-old boy with the testosterone hormones raging and all, Clara's like, shit happens. And so Jamie laughed and shook his head, and he said, he'll not lay a finger on the lass, or Hiram will break his neck, and Hiram would have told him so. She says, well, that's reassuring. Do you think perhaps you should drop a word in his ear yourself, as Fanny's loco parentis, I mean? He says, locum. I love how he corrects her Latin. And says, no, I'll just bid him welcome and terrify him with my presence. He won't dare breathe on her Sassenach. Which I kind of loved. So then we get this interesting bit. Claire says, I think she believed you when you said you didn't expect her to be a whore, but half her life exposed to all she was has left a mark. And Jamie pauses for a bit, and then he says, you healed me of a good deal worse, Sassenach, he said, and touched my hand gently. He touched me with his right hand, the maimed one. I didn't, I protested. You did that yourself. You had to. All I did was, drug me with opium and fornicate me back to life. Aye, that. It wasn't fornication, I said rather primly, though we were married. Aye, it was, he said, and his mouth tightened as well as his grip. It wasn't only you I was swiving, and you ken that as well as I do. If I did, it wasn't anything I was ever going to admit, let alone discuss, and I let it lie. But I grant you, neither of us could do the like for Frances, maybe Cyrus can, by not touching her. So 2 comments here. First, this has caused a little bit of a fandom kerfuffle, that Jamie was in essence swiving Claire as if to swive Blackjack Randall. So to explain that, someone shared this comment and asked Diana that if she was taking it wrong to correct her. And Diana replied, yes, that's correct. And here's what the girl said. She said, what it said to me was that Jamie, and one must remember he was out of his mind at the time, was raping BJR just as BJR had raped him. In other words, this was a vengeful act, part of fighting back against the man who tortured and subjugated him. But it's not a conscious, mindful decision, but rather Jamie acting out of a primitive, mindless fury. So that's how she co-signed that idea. Second point, note the connection there made between the Abby healing and the John and Claire sex. John used almost the identical line in talking to Claire about their incident, and really kind of talking to Jamie about the incident, as Jamie just did, talking about what he did with Claire and substituting BJR in it. Both times, this conjuring was used to affect healing of the soul. Okay? So I'm kind of hoping that Jamie sees that connection rather than just the connection of what Blackjack Randall did to him in prison with John. I hope he sees the connection. It was also what Claire did with Jamie to help heal him, and what they did for each other was to help heal them. So this chapter ends with Jamie working on the roof, Claire bringing him a snack, and they spot Cyrus coming up by himself, and Claire asks if his family is coming. And Jamie says he likely wants to come himself early to see Frances without them breathing down his back. And Claire wonders if she should chaperone. Jamie says, nay, Sassenach, I told my sister what was ado. She'll keep an eye on him without scaring the shit out of Cyrus. She says, you think I would? And he laughed. I do. Do you not ken all the fisher folk think you're the next door to a witch, if not a banshee outright? Even Hiram makes the horns behind your back when he comes near you. I wasn't at all sure how I felt about that. It was true that I had inadvertently raised Hiram's mother-in-law from the dead at her funeral. Though she died more permanently a few minutes later, she had time to denounce Hiram for not paying for a sufficiently lavish funeral. But I thought the effect might have worn off by now. Now, there we see, in a kind of a somewhat elegant way, rather than being blunt and obvious, a very nice transition to the next chapter, even though it's a little erroneous because Claire did not bring Mrs. Wilson back to life. It kind of happened on her own. They were all sitting down. She wasn't even touching Mrs. Wilson at the time. But Claire did deal with it as soon as it happened and said, okay, she's not long for the world, like it dealt with it after. So you see these transitions. I keep trying to point them out to you because it happens all through the chapter transitioning into the next. So Claire looks at the third floor expanse and notes that if they really end up needing this space, they will be in trouble. Kind of sounds a little foreshadowing there. And after a pause, Jamie agrees. And then he calls Claire to the edge. I'm trying to figure out a way to block this light from coming in. I can do that. I can't hold my hand there forever. She looks over the edge and Cyrus is sprinkling water over his tools and praying over his tools. She says he's blessing his tools. And he says, of course, Presbyterians may be heretics, Sassenach, but they still believe in God. I best go down now and bid him welcome. I love how he still calls Presbyterians heretics. So let me ask you, before I get out of this chapter, for you guys to answer, do you think that Cyrus will end up being Fanny's ultimate match? I think he's a nice kid, but I say no. I say no, that this isn't going to be a permanent thing between them, but you never know. So now we get to chapter 54, Moonrise, which is one of the very standout chapters in this section to me, along with 58, which was exceptional. And note on a reread all the moon mentions. There's at least 12 mentions of the moon in this chapter. She even quotes the highwayman at one point. And we also get a lot of hair mentions. And when we deep dive this chapter, we'll have to talk about all the symbolism because there's a lot of it in this chapter. Remember, the moon is symbolic of woman and her power. Claire's moon rising and the new hair color rising off of her scalp of the moon color. That's the ultimate thing of what the moon rising is. And it's tied around a birth, which is also tied to a woman and her courses and her power and all of that stuff. So all of this is so craftily tied together. And there's a lot in this one. I'm really looking forward to exploring it. I can't do it in this type of situation, but I am really looking forward to the deep dive on this chapter. This and 58 could easily each have their own lesson. And likely will, when we get to it. So we start with the Frasers waking up to a pounding on the door, and Jamie is down the stairs like a shot, and you see Claire making deductions, and you see her senses about the nature of the emergency. And she hears Jamie questioning and soothing, so she knows it's for her. Turns out that it's a girl a little older than Fanny, so maybe 13, 14 years old. They had never met this girl. Her name's Agnes Cloudtree. Her mother's in labor, and something is wrong. She's half frozen. Fanny brings her a shawl. She can't explain where she lives, but she says she can take them. And Jamie tries to determine how long she's walked. He's asking her questions about the sun and the moon. Was the moon up? She says 2 hands' breadth above the edge of the earth, which Claire notes was very poetic. But it also has a sense of the natural and the elemental and the Native American when you talk like that. And this entire incident has a Native American connection, being over the Cherokee line, having the husband be a Cherokee. And this all becomes a callback to Nyaweni's prophecy, So Diana did some really masterful undertoned weaving through this entire chapter. I'm just kind of glinting on a few of them. So Jamie looks at the sky, determines that the brave wee lass has been abroad in the night alone for about 3 hours, Sassenach. He says, Miss Agnes, is there a decent trail that leads to your father's place? So can you imagine this poor thing in the freezing night, with wild animals, traversing through God knows what, to get from the over the Cherokee line to the Fraser's Ridge, by herself. It makes me even more mad when I think about the father slapping her. But anyway, so Jamie goes with them and they head out with Miranda and a pissed off Clarence about doing this kind of nonsense at this time. And as they make their way, Claire has Agnes riding with her and starts asking these diagnostic questions and making conclusions. And Claire is interested to note the girl's knowledge. It turns out that this girl has helped in delivering the previous births of her brothers. At the top of the ridge, Jamie wants Agnes to come and join him on his horse as a guide for the rest of the way, and she stiffens and is hesitant, but then comes. So I bet her father abuses her or something, the way she's reacting. Well, you already saw that once with the slap. I mean, that was not a normal reaction. So Claire's hair is flying straight up in the wind, okay? And it's in bright moonlight, and Jamie smiles and tells her not to take flight yet. She quotes the Highwayman. Now check the comments. I put musical links for all of the different song mentions in this section. And I have a really beautiful one of The Highwayman, which is actually a poem set to a song. And it's a really gorgeous version by Lorena McKennitt. So check that out when you can. So they cross the treaty line and you get more moon references and references to the color white, such as a white blaze briefly showing by moonlight marked one of the witness trees that marked the treaty line. The moon was high overhead. So just to kind of give you the way this keeps like a reiteration of this theme. So they get there, and as Agnes gets her hand on the door, it gets pulled open, making her fall. Aaron Cloudtree yanks her off the floor, slaps her, yelling, "Where the hell you been, girl?" Bunch of slap happy people in this book. Drunk mean bastard. So Clarence gets scared off, takes off, and he says to Claire, "Who in tarnation are you?" And she calmly says, "I, sir, am the midwife. Do please go sit down." Which I kind of love. At this point, I was beyond happy that Jamie was there with her and decided to go with her. Agnes' two brothers were clinging to their mother. Agnes gets them out of the way. The woman is a little stunned that this angel midwife has come to her house in the middle of this crisis. And Claire begins to examine her and knows something is wrong. And so does Susanna, what's the mother's name is Susanna. She's been pushing too long. And we get more contractions. And as Claire's trying to make heads or tails out of what she's feeling, she realizes that she's feeling two heads, that we have twins. So she tells Susanna, who said she suspected it. She notes that one twin isn't moving at all. And she can feel at this point a small pulse. So it was still alive, but it wasn't moving. So the way Diana writes it all, it's all very gripping. You feel like you're right there with her through the contractions and the crushing her hands and all of the emotion. And she grimly realizes the direness of the situation. And she says to Susanna, "The twins are tangled together," I said as calmly as I could. "Susanna," I said, leaning forward to look into her eyes, "the babies can't get out. I can't get them out. If we keep doing this, they'll die and you might die too." Easily, she thinks in her mind. I took a deep breath. Her hand had come down to rest on mine atop her rigid belly. "Wait," she whispered, and they wrote another contraction. And then she says, "What else?" She says, "I can cut you open and take the babies out. It will be awful and it will be painful." She says, "It can't be worse than this." Claire puts her head on the woman's stomach. She's trying to gather her own emotions. And the lady says, "Will I die then?" And Claire says, "Very likely. But we might save the babies. I'll do my best." And then the lady says, "Save them." So at this point, reading this, I'm a little freaked out, to be honest. I'm thinking, like, are we really going to cut this woman open and yank these babies out and let this woman, is this woman going to die? Is this going to be the thing, like the trauma that, haunts Claire? Or, like, what are we going to do here? I was kind of worried about I was all caught up in the emotion of it. And blessed Jamie is there laying out her tools, being this calm presence. And it really reminded me of the Tench Bledsoe scene, how he teamed with her in the medical emergency of that. I kind of love when you see him teaming with her in a medical thing. So it turns out that both he and Agnes had heard what she said, and poor Agnes is terrified. But Jamie told her, it'll be all right, lass. Go take care of your brother. The boys and Pa are asleep in the shed, apparently, and Agnes begs to help. And Susanna calls her over, and Agnes runs to her, hugging her and sobbing, and so heartbreaking. And she's saying to the lady, to Susanna, it'll be all right, Ma. Mr. Fraser says so. And Susanna looks at Jamie and she said, you say so, Mr. Fraser? And he says, I do. And she goes through another contraction, and then she turns back to him and says, your wife says I'm going to die. And Jamie says, I've got more faith in her than she does. But I suppose it's your choice who to believe. What do you want to do, Sassenach? So that's interesting. Like, you see this little nod about faith, in that line. I like that before this whole thing kicks off. So we get Suzanne on the floor. She tells Jamie to hold her tight, and the tension is just absolutely palpable in this moment. Jamie's holding her up top. Claire is praying for help. The blade is on her belly, and just about as she's about to cut, Susanna screams, and another contraction. I think the repositioning of her maybe helped. The head crowns and all systems shift, and she pushes again, and out pops the baby, a boy, and there's this flurry to clear and wrap the baby. Jamie cuts the cord. Claire reaches in for the other one, and it says she closed her eyes to see better, which I kind of love that line. She closed her eyes to see better. Another rolling contraption, and a limp blue foot appears, and Claire is cursing and reaches up for the still baby to get the other foot. It says, a sense of remoteness came over me, and I closed my eyes and swallowed. The feeling of the solid stillness of a tiny body came into my hands. They call it stillbirth because it is, not because the child is dead, but because everything goes quiet. A tiny, still girl. I knew she was gone, but the stubbornness made me lift her and try to push breath into the still lungs. My fingers on the tiny chest, hoping against hope, but she was gone. Your heart's breaking a little, because we know, we're already feeling these faith echoes here. And so she turns to Susanna and tells her she has a son, and Susanna asks about the other baby. Claire says, I'm sorry, you have a son. So as she turns to get the cloth to do the afterbirth work, she sees Jamie bend over the baby with this grief-stricken expression, and he locks eyes with Claire. He read the name in each other's face. Faith. I nodded, and my throat closing with a grief as sharp as it had been when I lost her. Jamie bowed his head and, reaching out, touched the tiny wrinkled body, his hand nearly covering her. A tear fell and glistened on the back of his hand, another on the curve of her forehead, red in the firelight. Oh my goodness, it was so moving. I was like a ball when Jamie cries. I'm kind of toast when that happens. So Claire, moved by deep memories of her long ago loss, she picks up the baby and holds her to her own chest, and she feels transported back to the time in the hospital, holding the baby against her heart. Her emotions are pouring out, and she's feeling the heartbreak. And Jamie says to let him take her, and he's holding out his hands, and Claire says she can't. And she keeps holding her and rocking her, and she's curled around her, wanting to kind of give her own heartbeat into this baby, give her own heat of life into this baby. And when it's being described, you get this vision of the show of Claire rocking this baby and holding this baby. It's just so heartbreaking. And then we get this paragraph. There was nothing sudden, no sound, no movement, but in the midst of the searing grief, I slowly realized something. It didn't happen. It was already there, but I hadn't felt it. And now I did. Claire? Jamie's hand touched my shoulder, and I seized it with my free hand and held on. Warmth. Strength. Stay, I said to him. and to her breathless, "Stay." My heart, I was still feeling it distinctly, slow and regular. I let go of Jamie's hand, but he didn't take it away. Holding the baby in one arm, I laid the other on her back, feeling no sensation, nothing I could say that I felt. But there was something there. My feeling here is that Jamie's energy was part of this whole process, that he put his hand on her and she was drawing from that strength to help push it into the child. It's all very beautiful. And we find out by the end of this whole thing, he's wrapped around her the way she's wrapped around this baby, if you kind of get the visual of it. And so I believe what I feel is happening here is that she felt the child's soul, its spirit, its essence that was still with it. It had not flown, it had not gone from the baby. As if, like something dies and the spirit is still around you, like the philosophy is you open the door to let the soul out, but the soul's still around even though the person's dead. This is what I kind of feel like. The soul had not flown, the spirit had not left yet of this baby, even though the baby was dead. And I believe that Claire senses the energy of that spirit. And that's what she feels like, something's there, even though the baby wasn't breathing, the heart wasn't beating. Something was there that she felt. And I believe it's the energy of this child's spirit. This is my theory on it. It's not totally clear. And I think that Claire is drawing that back in, and so she mentally pushes, almost like a mother's labor. It's almost like you get it's almost like having this happen in a childbirth is so significant to woman and to her growing into her power and into this whole moon idea and all of that. It's all very symbolic. And so she remembers, she almost feels like she can almost feel the baby starting to warm. And she passes it off that it's close to the fire, and that's what the deal is. And she remembers what Roger said McEwen did. And she starts to follow that, starts tapping the baby's back in rhythm. And I think this is what Diana meant when she said what McEwen did for Roger is more about what it does for Claire than what it did for Roger. And this is what it is, because him telling her that story, she leaned on that knowledge in this situation, because it was a very similar situation. She's trying to get his heart started and back into a rhythm of some kind. So she starts tapping on the baby's back in rhythm. And so it says she heard things around her, but was removed from it, kind of in this bubble, and just becoming the sound of a heartbeat. And in time, there were two of them in that sound. And she thinks of Malva and the blue spark and that she saw fade in her hands with that baby. And she says she saw it now. Now, I don't know if she actually visibly saw the blue with her eyes, or if it's something in her mind that she's envisioning it. She says she saw it now, wills the spark to stay, stops the tap after a while, the first tap, and the heartbeat of the baby goes on. And it almost feels like, listening to this, it's almost like we're getting the other side, the other perspective of the healer's perspective of what Roger experienced in the room with McEwen when he describes how they were all in that heartbeat. They were all all supporting with their energy. Remember, he was talking about that. And that's because I believe McEwen is using their strength, their energies to support this one he's trying to heal. And I think that's what's happening here as well. I could go on and on with this chapter. Anyway, I better stop. So she starts to come back to herself. And Jamie has his arms wrapped around her from behind. And Agnes offers her cider. Jamie says to bring a blanket for her sister. He lays a hand on the baby in benediction and takes Claire out. And my immediate feeling on this event, like I said, was that the essence of the baby, its spirit, soul, was still there. And as long as that was so, she could be revived. So it's not a matter that you could just go and she could take some long dead person and revive them. I don't think that's what we're talking about here. I think it's that as long as it's recent and that spirit is still around, and that energy of that person, the energy of their essence was still around, she can draw that back. And that's what I think happened, personally. But she was, in body, dead. So that's kind of what I see it. Her life force was still around, but her body and her systems had died. So of course, this whole story has everybody spinning about Faith. Is it possible that Master Raymond brought Faith back? After all, he's a much more powerful healer than Claire, at least definitely at this point. So, I mean, he's like the greatest healer of them all, probably. He's the original. So, I don't know. I'm thinking no. My personal feeling is no. I kind of feel like that's kind of a misdirect by Diana here to want people to think that. But you never know. Maybe it's no now, but as she starts working with it, it'll change. She's very like that. She can think this isn't going to happen, but then as she starts working with it, it talks to her a different way, and she ends up moving a different way with it. That's how Diana writes. She's almost like free thinking to what occurs when she's in the midst of it. And if she tries to fight what she's feeling led to do, it just doesn't work. She kind of has to roll with it a little. Right now, I'm kind of feeling she's kind of pointing it so much that it almost feels like a misdirect, which I'm going to get into that as well. Let me know what you think. Do you think that this is indicating? I mean, it could be. It could be. I'm not discounting it. I see some people are. I'm not discounting it, but it could be. But I'm right now saying I don't think so. I don't think that somehow Master Raymond saved Faith. But maybe. Jamie takes Claire out to head home, and the moon had set. We get this image of Claire like coming down off of this surge and kind of reconnecting to like the earth and to Jamie and to everything, around her. And they both felt trembly and electric from this whole experience, just like we saw Roger felt after he experienced that whole thing. The whole thing was kind of left him feeling like almost an emptiness, that he was separated from this miracle that had happened. And so it says, you see it all simultaneously from outside yourself and from your deepest core. The usual intervening layers of flesh and thought have become transparent. I'm fine, I said, and I laughed. I let my forehead fall against his chest and breathed for a moment, feeling all my pieces come to rest, whole again, as the enchantment of the last hour faded into peace. Jamie, I said, raising my head, what color is my hair? All the colors of the earth, he said, and smoothed the hair from my face. But here, all about your face, it's the color of moonlight, McGry. So the title takes on, I mean, when you read that, you were like, oh my God, and so the title takes on this whole new dimension. And it's like this wow, wow, wow moment. Because the whole time you're thinking, with all the moon things, you're just like, you're not sure what to think. But then when he says that, you go, wow, like that's the moonrise. Is that her new hair is growing in white now? So actually, like, if she was to cut her hair into a crew cut, her hair would be white, or just about white. All of her roots, all of her, like, she's going white in the closest hair to her head around her face. So what a chapter, what an ending. This will be one of those moments that resonate with you through the series. You'll remember, like, this is when her power came to the surface. So the new growth is white. And so the prophecy is emerging about her power. And I did have to kind of graze through this chapter, but I am looking forward to the deep dive, and we'll chat more in the comments. As far as transition to the next chapter, you will see the moon again as a touch point for another woman in the story, Rachel. And so that's kind of how you see this transition here. Chapter 55. The Venom of the North Wind. Rachel POV on this chapter. And so Rachel woke with Ian's hand on her mouth, warning her with his eyes. Ian is tense and listening and takes a deep breath, and he smells tobacco. And he goes naked to the door, chatting with friends on the porch, naked. You're sitting there just like having merry conversation with people that came to your door, and you're naked. I get they're Indians, but damn, So He sticks his head back in, smiles, grabs a blanket now to wrap around his waist because I guess he finally realized, I should be sitting here having a conversation with my wingding hanging out. Anyway, it was odd. I kind of found that odd. I get that's what they did, but still, it seems odd when you're sitting there in your cabin on Fraser's Ridge and you're having this normal life to kind of go into that mode when you answer the door. I was kind of like, well, alrighty then. So at first thought it was a couple of Cherokee friends, and then she hears a word that freezes her. It's not Cherokee, and it was Mohawk, and the word was Wakiate Shinosa, which was Emily. And so she steps out in her shift and shawl, and Ian is talking to three Mohawks who nod to her and say something to Ian, who coughs and looks sideways at her, which I wish I knew what that was said. So she tells him that his friends are welcome. Will they eat with us? They all come in. And she grabs Ian to get the scoop. And he says that Joseph Brant massacred a Whig village and a revenge raid hit the Mohawk. And he doesn't know if Emily and her children are alive. And nothing is said about Sun Elk, so I don't know if he lived or died through this massacre. Then Ian looks at the distant mountain, and she knows what he's thinking. He's thinking far north where Emily and her children live. Rachel serves and then leaves for some private privy time. She didn't want to be around people. She makes her way to an outcrop overlooking a mountain vista. She's trying to draw in the peace of that. And she wants to know more about Emily, this woman that Ian married and had loved. She had never asked much about her, but she determines that she will now. And she looks at the moon and she absorbs the peace, and she turns to her inner light and she waits. And Ian sits next to her an hour later, and everyone, including the baby, are sleeping. He says he gave them whiskey. And she says, how very hospitable of thee, Ian. He said, that wasn't exactly my intention, but I suppose I should take credit for it if it makes you think more highly of me. So now he brushes her hair behind her ear and kisses her neck, and she knows, he wants some rumpy pumpy time. She hesitates for the briefest instant, but then she gave herself to it. She lies back on her shawl beneath the star-strewn sky, and she thinks, let it just be us once more. If he thinks of her, let him not do it now. I have to say that Rachel really impressed me in this section. She's handling this so maturely for a girl of her age. The next day, she asks what she looks like. And Ian said she was small, 4 inches shorter than Rachel, and neat. And then he hesitates, saying, with a pretty face. And she says, if she is beautiful, Ian, thee may say so. I'm a friend, and we aren't given to vanity. He looked at her, his lips twitching a little, and he thought better of whatever he'd been about to say, closed his eyes for an instant, opened them, and then he answered her honestly. She was lovely. So Ian is no dummy, but he's thinking, yeah, okay, sure, I ain't buying that. And he tells about how they met, his impressions. He admits he thinks of her now and then. And Rachel's like, why shouldn't you think of her? She was thy wife, the mother of your children. And Ian says, I have to tell you something. So here's the oh boy moment. Her heart clenches. She's braced for whatever. And he tells her about swiftest of lizards. And again, we see this is a new trust and bonding in this relationship, just like in the chapter with Roger and Bree, just like last chapter with Jamie and Claire. Now we see it here with Ian and Rachel. He bent his head and rested on hers. They stood forehead to forehead, eye to eye. I didn't ken Rachel, he said quietly, and then Rachel says, we have to go, she said, though her heart had gone so small, she could barely feel its beating. Of course, we must go. So you also get this little echo of that idea too. So I'm really super impressed with Rachel here. She shows such poise in this shocking revelation, such poise and selflessness. And this is the kind of woman, just for whatever it's worth, that I want for Willie. I got news. Amaranthus would never make such a selfless choice like this. Speaking of incredible women, we get to the next chapter, chapter 56, thee would make a good friend. And that focuses on the deepening bond of yet another relationship, another trust shared. See the pattern forming here. What a wonderful chapter highlighting the rich bond forming between Rachel and Jenny. How special for Rachel, who never had a mother, to have someone like Jenny in her life now. Can't keep holding that thing. So you get a real sense of their comfortable connection and their banter and their humor and real love and affection for each other. And Rachel tells her that she would make a good friend. It amuses Jenny. And so Rachel begins to catalog why. And you can just feel the affection between them in this chapter. Rachel says, "You're forthright, direct, and honest." To which Jenny says that she can be a fine wee liar when needed. Then Rachel says she's compassionate, kind, and fearless. And Jenny says, "Fearless? Me?" She made a noise that Rachel would have spelled as psh. "I've been scared to the bone since I was 10 years old, Leannan. But you get used to it, Ken." She says, "What happened when thee was 10? She says, "My mother died." And her expression and voice were both matter of fact, but Rachel could hear the bereavement in it. So you see what a read of people Rachel is and how she regards Jenny. And so Rachel shares her mother died when she was born, but she dreams of a woman sometimes with dark hair. Jenny touches her cheek. And it's just all really lovely, you know. Jenny tells Rachel that Bree is the spitting image of her own mother. And we find out that Rachel feels she's a little intimidated by Bree, which kind of surprised me a little bit. You know, I wouldn't have expected that. Jenny explains her fear wasn't for herself, that she was never worried about death, which is the first little bit of foreboding that we get for Jenny, which happens a lot. She said it was more fear for Jamie and her dad. "I didn't care how to take care of him. I can't well. I couldn't have filled my mother's place for either one. See, I thought they'd die without her." And Rachel thinks, "And you be left entirely alone, wanting to die too, not knowing how. It does seem easier for men. I wonder why. Do they not think that anybody needs them?" So then Rachel says to Jenny, "Thee managed though." And Jenny shrugged. "I put on her apron and I made their supper. That was all I can to do. Feed them." And Rachel says, "I suppose that was the most important thing." So now Jenny smiles looking at Rachel and the baby, and she talks about when bairns are young, you're all they need, and then they grow and you fear that you can't keep them from all that could harm them. At this point, Rachel kind of trumps Ian, and she tells Jenny before Ian can tell her that they plan to go north to New York to check on the welfare of, and then she pauses. And Jenny says, "The Indian woman he was wed to." And she said, "I figured that he would when she heard about the massacre." And so Rachel let her know that she was going too, and is shocked to see that Jenny kind of figured that too. And Jenny says, "Fearless, you said," Jenny said meditatively. "Friends are fearless, are they? We don't fear death because we think our lives are lived only in the preparation for the eternal life with God." Rachel explained, "Well, if the worst thing that can happen to you is death, and you're no afraid of that, well then," Jenny shrugged, "I suppose you're right." Her face crinkled suddenly, and she laughed. "Fearless. I'll need to think on that one for a bit. Get used to it, Ken. But still," she lifted her chin, indicating Augie. "Do you not fear for him, taking him all the way through a war?" She didn't add, "Wouldn't losing him be worse than death?" But she didn't need to. "Would thee let thy husband go alone 700 miles to rescue his first wife and her 3 children, one of whom might just possibly be his?" Jenny's mouth opened, but apparently there was no Scottish sounds appropriate to the occasion. "Well, no," she said mildly. "Thee has a point." Made me crack up. So I noted a few things about that last bit. Again, we get the foreboding talk about not fearing death. We also see Jenny swallowing the idea of being fearless, which makes another great transition to the next bit where we find out that Jenny has decided to go. Also, that Jenny had no clue about Swiftest of Lizards, which means that Ian Sr. never told her that secret that was shared with him from Ian. And last, capping the chapter with Jenny using plain speech in this chapter about Jenny's friend-like qualities was just perfect, and it made me laugh, when I read it. So I just love that. So next, in chapter 57, ready for anything. We get another bit of bonding, this time between Ian and Jenny, which we don't really see that often on page. Ian goes to his mother in the goat shed to tell her his plan and arrangements he's made for her while he and Rachel are gone. And there's a racket as the rain is pounding down on the tin roof, and it sounds like gunfire, which is another little foreboding nod. And she's singing a walking song called Mille Margis Nagal, I know I'm saying it wrong, translated to 1,000 curses on love. And she's singing that at the top of her lungs as she milks the goats. When she finishes, Ian applauds. And I put a link in the notes to hear that song, as well as a link to the lyrics. So now they look at the mountain in the distance with black clouds and big lightning strikes, and starts little fires on the mountain. And Jenny notes that it looks like the Mackenzie clan badge. And Ian didn't know what that looked like. And he doesn't know the Murray mottos. And Jenny remembers it was all gone by the time he could walk. And it's kind of sad. And it's also a great transition to Culloden's talk next chapter. So you see what we're doing here. There's always like a little nod to something, mentioned in the chapter before about what's to come in the next chapter. So we find out some interesting information here. The Murrays have two mottos: Firth Fortune and Fill the Fetters. She said, go ye out and make sure you come back with gold and captives, is what that means. Like, go forth, find fortune, and fill the fetters. Ian laughs, and Jenny says, well, Ian Sr. and Jamie were mercenaries. And then she adds that the Murrays had a second motto later, to pray, meaning ready for anything. And notes that she often thought about it when they were away, that side by side, they're J sweet pray, to pray. I am ready for anything. And how perfect is that? I mean, the fact that that's the mottos, and that these people, like the way that works out is just, I think, so kismet, And again, we're adding more context to what we knew in the past. So Ian figures this is a good segue, and he says he has made arrangements for her to stay with the Chisholms while he and Rachel go north to see about, and he hesitates. And before I go on, I kind of wonder why he's arranging for Jenny to stay with the Chisholms rather than with Jamie and Claire. You would think she would stay with Jamie and Claire. With the Max and Germaine gone, they have plenty of room. They could certainly have Jenny, this one little lone lady, stay there by herself. So it was weird that that's what he arranged, but that's beside the point since she's not staying there anyway. Before he can say anything else, Ian is floored that his mom is all over this. Oh, your Indian wife, dinner fash. She says, I made arrangements for the goat. We're all good to go, It's like, and it was just funny because Ian's just kind of gobsmacked. She's just stepping out into fearless mode of being like this Quaker wannabe. And Ian's like, you what? He felt as though she'd stuck a foot out and hooked his legs out from under him. She gave him a look of mild exasperation. You didn't think I'd let Rachel follow you alone through a war, and her with that lolloping great baron of yours. But the words died in his throat. He kenned his mother well enough to see she meant it. He'd seen that look on Uncle Jamie's face often enough to recognize it now. So here you see her starting to lay another piece of transition here. First the Culloden reflection. Now you see her bringing forth the connection of Jamie and Jenny together. This is what I'm saying in craft-wise. So besides, she added, as a nod to the first Fraser motto, she says, I didn't suppose you'll find much gold with the Mohawk, but I just as soon you didn't end up in fetters yourself in a redcoat prison. So it was like a nice little play on the first motto. There wasn't much left to do to that but laugh. He had one last try, though, so he could tell his dad he had. Do you think Dad would let you go and do such a daft thing? I didn't see he'd have much room to talk. Besides, he wouldn't have tried to stop me. Wee Augie is his blood as much as mine. Ian Moore will be right there with me all the way. Ian swallowed a wee lump in his throat, but felt curiosity along with remembered grief. Do you feel Dad by you? He asked. I do sometimes. She says, you didn't stop loving someone because their deed, she said reprovingly. I cannot suppose they stopped loving you either. I love it. So Jenny has come a long way from never leaving Lollipop. This was such a lovely relationship moment between Ian as an adult, talking to his mom. You sense Ian Sr.'s presence must have been there among this conversation, smiling. And note that we are getting rule of three, consecutive chapters of meaningful relationship moments for Jenny. And each one is getting more intense as we go. First Rachel, now we have her son Ian, and now we're going to go to Jamie. And while they're all poignant, each one adds a little bit of foreboding at the end of a section like this, as almost like this ode to Jenny. We'll talk more on this in a few minutes. And I think it's to let you know what a big step this is for Jenny and how fraught with danger this trip is, and to kind of put a little bit of foreboding sense into your soul. I'm a wee bit worried that both of Jamie's right-hand men in the family are leaving at the same time, and for a long time. The last time this happened, the freaking Browns surrounded them and arrested them and drugged them off in custody. You know what I mean? So I don't like it that it just seems like all of these key people are leaving at the same time and leaving the Ridge and leaving them kind of to deal with things on their own. Well, at least Bobby's still there, right? So the chapter ends with the final transition as Rachel is asking Ian how old his mother is. She says while she welcomes her company and her help with Augie, will this journey be too much for her? And Ian answers in terms of her connection to Jamie. Again, we get a third transitional moment. He says, I didn't ken for sure, he says in answer to her question. She's 2 years the elder of Uncle Jamie, though. Oh, her face eased a bit at that. And it's barely a year since she left Scotland and came with Uncle Jamie all the way across the ocean and then making their way hundreds of miles cross country to Philadelphia. This journey may be a bit longer, he coughed a little, thinking, and just a bit more dangerous, he's thinking. But we'll have good horses and enough money for inns where there are any. Besides, he said, shrugging, she says she's coming with us. So she is. So with that reminder of Jenny and Jamie's connection and their journey so far, we transition into chapter 58, Telling Beads, which is our last chapter. This chapter is really a treasure and a triumph, I think. It's very complex, very layered. It's much too deep to get deeply into here. But finally we learned what happened at Culloden with Jamie, Murtaugh, and BJR. It's also a really beautiful window into the deep and close connection of Jamie and Jenny, which is one of the most beloved and enduring relationships in the series when you go from the beginning to the end. It's a very heartwarming and it's an enlightening survey of the past, this chapter, including their parents, including Murtaugh. Lots of symbolism in this chapter. This one really does need a deep dive, and you have to read it very closely to get all the detail and nuance, which we can't do here. But we will just hit the highlights and save the rest. But definitely when we do the deep dive, make sure you're tuned in for this chapter because there'll be a lot to discuss. But I think so far in this book, this is the richest chapter. And that's why I think it ends the middle section, almost the very middle of the book. So we open with Jamie the next day, who apparently has no clue about any of this happening. He's walking in the upper meadow, and which is called Fure Millis, which means sweetgrass, and he's hunting a bear that Joe spotted a couple days ago. And they need it for meat, fat, and hide for the winter. And it's very sweet how he thinks of Claire, that she gets colder now in the winter. I love the POV of his natural observations, the way he's so tuned in with his surrounding world, like a hunter's look. He takes comfort in his old plaid, which is also kind of an echo to the past, a symbol of the past. And he thinks he'd like to be buried in it because it would give him comfort in the grave, and warmth. He sees 3 does. He smells a buck close by. He says, not in full rut, but interested. Like he could tell how much in rut the bucket is. I love that. He hears his sister coming with a line of goats to graze, and they have this adorable banter. He teases her about her gun, that it would barely give a bear a nosebleed. And we traverse a number of memories and nods. Claire was alarmed waking up with him gone with the gun, and he winces knowing she was thinking of when he disappeared to go hunt the lumpkin. And the first time he killed a bear himself, and Claire hitting him in the head with the fish. We talk about Jenny's fondness for goats, and she says a goat has a mind of its own. He says, and so do you. Ian always said you like the goats because they are just as stubborn as you are. She gave him a long look. Pot, she said succinctly. Kettle, he replied, flicking grass at her. And it's just really this heartwarming look at their relationship. So she says she comes up here to think and pray. And then she purses her lips, and Jamie knows she has something on her mind she wants to talk about. But he gives her her space. And we get a reminder of the fortune teller's prophecy and he wants to know if he should count when Leary shot him, so we get another reminder of that. She said no, if Claire didn't come back, he would have drugged himself to go and get her. And he says she's probably right. And so then they hear what Jenny thinks is a magpie, which has great superstition in Great Britain. They're birds of omen. And if you just hear one, it's for sorrow. And so they're listening for another. But Jamie puts Jenny at ease and tells her it's a yaffle. But he himself starts recalling the magpie charm whenever he hears the calls. And I included the link in the notes of a particularly haunting version of the magpie song and the lyrics, although the lyrics do vary with different versions. She asks if he holds the match with Leary against her. And Jenny, you get the sense that Jenny senses that she might not make it back from this excursion, as she's wanting to make sure all air is cleared with everybody, So she wants to make sure that her and Jamie are okay. Even though they've talked about this before, I think she wants to definitely make sure that there's no animosity or in their heart. They've talked about everything. He gave her a look and he says, "What makes you think you could make me do anything I didn't want to do, you wee fuss budget?" She says, "What the devil is a fuss budget?" Frowning up at him. He says, "A bag of nuisance as far as I can tell," he admitted. Jenny calls Mandy that. A sudden dimple appeared near Jenny's mouth, but she didn't actually laugh. She said, "You ken what I mean." He says, "I do, and I don't hold it against you, I mean. She didn't actually kill me after all." So this chapter feels like this survey of the Outlander series with all these little intricate brush strokes here or there between this brother and sister and all the things they've seen and done together and been around each other for in this series. And he asks her if she wants to tell the beads together like they used to. And she pulls out this gorgeous pearl rosary that belonged to her mother. And this leads to a conversation about their parents and Murtaugh. And we find out some new information, which I guarantee she is seeding the prequel book to come with this whole section. That Brian was jealous of the pearl necklace that she got from an admirer and that she wouldn't reveal. Jamie tells Jenny the scoop about McGrannick, which is like another brushstroke in the tapestry of this chapter, and how she went away with Brian before he had a chance at the gathering to approach her. I think that gathering is going to be an excellent part of that prequel. I really can't wait to read it. Anyway, Brian was jealous, like father, like son, I guess, and worried that she was second guessing her choice. And so he sold a field, and what he told Murtaugh what he wanted to do with the money to get a gift for her for the new baby when it was born, which was Willie. Murtaugh offered to get something as Brian couldn't leave her so pregnant and with the house not finished. This surprises Jamie. He's like, wasn't he aware of how Murtaugh felt about her? And Jenny said he loved Murtaugh too, more than a brother. So I'm really just so in on the prequel. I just think it's going to be so cool. Jamie says he missed Murtaugh. And Jenny says that she wishes he could have been buried at Lollybrock with Mam and Dad, which brings Jamie's mind to where his bones do actually lay. It's fitting that Jenny is the one to evoke these memories for Jamie. Jamie nodded, his throat suddenly feeling tight. Murtaugh lay with the fallen of Culloden, burnt and buried in some anonymous pit on that silent moor, his bones mingled with the others. No cairn for those who loved him to come and leave a stone to say so. Jenny laid a hand on his arm, warm through the cloth of his sleeve. Dinna mind it, brother, she said softly. He had a good death, and you with him at the end. How would you know it was a good death? Emotion made him speak more roughly than he meant. But she only blinked once, and then her face settled again. You told me, Egypt, she said dryly, several times. Do you not recall that? He stared at her for a moment, uncomprehending. I told you. How? I didn't ken what happened. This opens the door to the conversation about Culloden. And it turns out that in his 10-day fever, that Ian saved him from losing his leg. We get this lovely, tender Ian moment. There's so many beautiful moments in this chapter. It's almost like a tour de force chapter, you know. He sent the doctor away. She says he can't. You'd rather be dead. Her eyes filled abruptly with tears, and she turned away. And he caught her by the shoulder, felt her bones fine and light. Jenny, he said, Ian didn't want to be dead. Believe me, I did, but not him. No, he did it first, she said, and swallowed. But ye wouldn't have let him, he said, and he wouldn't have let you either. You didn't think ye had anything to do with it, he asked, rising to his feet and smiling down at her. For either of us? She said, but looked modestly pleased. So how sweet is this whole thing with them? I just love it. So she starts to haltingly tell him what he said, but she says it in a way to prompt him to remember it himself. And it's really exquisitely written in this very haunting and beautiful and fragmented, kind of out of order way that dreams and partial memory come back to a person, you know. And we'll study it as it's written in a deep dive. I'm kind of forcing myself to kind of summarize, or else this will be a 3-hour post. But in essence, here's the story when you start to put things in proper order as I see it. And you can let me know if I'm getting anything wrong here, but this is how I see it played out. Jamie fought his way across the field, ended behind the cannon, which we knew. He turned and saw the dead Highlanders being mowed down in rows. The backs of cannon crew were to him, so he thinks that he could take them out. But there's redcoats between. And when he wipes his face, this is where he started losing memory. If you remember, he always remembers that he got through, he ends up on the other side. Like, he remembers all that. But then he turns and he knows he went back, but he knows he wanted to go back across, but he can't kind of remember after. Everything kind of starts getting mixed up. Why? Now we find out why. Because when he turned, in the middle of those redcoats that lay between was Black Jack Randall, and he sees him. And it's very much like the show, you know. They stand frozen a minute in shock, looking at each other, and Jamie can't move. And out of the corner of his eye, he sees Murtagh running, bounding toward them. And as Murtagh's running, BJR says to Jamie, kill me, my heart's desire. And Murtagh stabs BJR from behind in the kidney, and BJR falls. But as this happens, the redcoats start to jump on Jamie and Murtagh, and Jamie gets bayoneted in the leg, he gets pummeled, and something distracts eventually the redcoats to leave them and move on to something else. And bleeding, you know, Jamie recognizes he's bleeding to death, and he's freezing because all of the water from the field is soaked up into him. And he looks around him and he sees Murtagh a couple yards away, curled up, and he drags himself over to Murtagh, who's bashed in the head, nearly dead, gathers him in his arms. Murtagh opens his eyes. He's lightened at seeing Jamie and tells him it doesn't hurt to die, touches his face and says, dinna be afraid. And a peace comes over Jamie. And Jamie kisses his mouth, lays his head on his hair. And at some point, he must have passed out, fallen back on his back. And Murtagh's laying next to him now. They're still holding each other's hand. And he's kind of in this mode of he's waiting to die. He's resigned. And then somehow BJR was managed to get back up on his feet. And he's standing over Jamie. And he's leaning down. And I interpret this as he wanted to die. He wanted his final death to be by Jamie's touch. And as his last touch. And so Jamie takes his dirk. And with his last bit of strength, pushes it up into BJR. And hot blood begins to rush down his arm and his hands and covers his face, and it starts to seal his eyes shut. And Randall dies on top of him, putting pressure on his own wound. And then we see this line: the blood, it spilled down my arm, and then I wasn't there anymore. Which is very curious when you think about what we know about, the ghosts and all that other stuff. But when I woke, my eyes were sealed shut with his dry blood. So after the memories come, he opens his eyes to see that tears are streaming down Jenny's face. And she's watching him. And he says, "Dinna weep, Leanne, it's over." And she says, "That's what you think, is it?" Oh, my. Now, if the chapter had stopped there, it would have been a triumph in writing, as it was. But Diana gives us even more. They go to tell their beads together, and he pulls the beads that she had made him out and explains that he had given them to Willie at Hellwater to remember him. And she says with sympathy, "Aye, and I expect he gave him back to you in Philadelphia." He says he did. And she says, "Tell you one thing, brother. He's no going to forget you." "Aye, maybe not," he said, feeling an unexpected comfort in the thought. Well then. So as they prepare to tell the beads, we get like a little bit of Willie here too. As they prepare to tell the beads, he hears another yaffle and wonders if it's a different one, and thinks 3 for a wedding and 4 for a death. And it sounds a little bit foreshadowing. Maybe we will see a death and a wedding in this book. So then, I'm wondering who will get the wedding. Maybe Bobby, maybe Jenny. Since this is being said with Jenny standing there, I'm trying to think if there's anybody else that we know that needs to be married. So now they go through dedicating each decade to different people. The first one goes to Murtama and Dad, then to elder and younger Ian, then to William. And with William, we get this lovely little bit from Jamie's thoughts. He didn't try to avoid thinking of William, but he didn't deliberately call the lad to mind either. There was nothing he could do to help until or unless William asked for it. And it would do neither of them good to worry about what the lad was doing or what might be happening to him. But he'd said William, and for the space of an Our Father and 10 Hail Marys and a Glory Be, William must perforce be in his mind. Guide him, he thought, between the words of the prayer. Give him good judgment. Help him be a good man. Show him his way. And Holy Mother, keep him safe for your own son's sake. World without end, amen, he said, reaching for the final bead. And I could not help but think of pigweed with this prayer. And I pray too, yes, Lord, give him good judgment for God's sake. Listen to this prayer from Jamie. So then they continue. We get a Michael and Joan mention. I mean, we're just like running through the gambit on this chapter. When done, they were silent. And it says the buck deer was gone. He'd heard it leave sometime while he was praying for William. And he wished his son good fortune on the hunt. So that sounds a little bit foreshadowing. We know that Willie is hunting for Ben's whereabouts. Is that like the figurative buck here that's being kind of foreshadowed? Will he be successful on that hunt? I kind of think, he will. But I like that kind of that little nod in there. So he tells Jenny if she dies before him, he will make sure her body goes to Scotland to be with Ian. And she said, you don't have to go to great lengths about it. And we see this fabulous end, which I'm going to read to end this whole thing. Because what is a Jamie and Jenny scene without a little bit of fireworks and a final tear, right? So he says, I don't. She says, well, see, I didn't ken where I might be come the time. If it's here, then of course. He says, where the devil else might you be? He demanded, with the dawning realization that she couldn't have come up here to tell him about Murtaugh because she hadn't known he needed to be told. So she says, I'm going with Ian and Rachel to find his Mohawk wife, she said, as casually as she might have said she was going to pull turnips. Before he could find a single word, she held up the rosary in front of his face. I'm leaving this with you, Ken. It's for Mandy, just in case I didn't come back. You ken well enough what sort of things can happen when you're traveling, she added, with a small moo of disapproval. Traveling, he said. Traveling? You mean to the thought of his sister small, elderly, and stubborn as an alligator, sunk in the mud, marching north through two armies in the dead of winter, beset by brigands, wild animals, and a half a dozen other things he could think of if he'd had time for it. I do. She gave him a look indicating that she didn't mean to bandy words for long. Where young Ian goes, Rachel says she's going to, and that means so does the wean. You didn't think I mean to leave my youngest grandchild to the mercies of bears, wild Indians, do you? That's a rhetorical question, she added with a pleased air of putting a stop to him. That means I didn't expect you to answer it. You wouldn't have ken a rhetorical question from a hole in the ground if I hadn't have told you what one was. Well, then, you should recognize one when it bites you on the nose, she said, sticking her own long neb up in the air. So Jamie is beside himself and flabbergasted at this quick turn that's happened. And he's like, I'll go talk to Rachel, he said, eyeing her. Surely she's better sense to. You think I didn't, she says, or young Ian. She shook her head, half admiringly. It'd be easier to move yon wee mountain there. She nodded at the bulk of Roan Mountain, looming dark and green in the distance, than to get that Quaker lass to change her mind once it's made up. But the bairn, he says. Aye, I said that too, she said a little irritably. You think I didn't mention that? And you know what? She did squinch her eyes for a bit, and then she said to me, reasonable as Sunday, would I let my husband go alone 700 miles to rescue his first wife and her 3 pitiable bairns, one of whom just might possibly be Ian's? Aye, and that's the first I heard of it too, she said, seeing his face. I see your point. Jesus, Jamie said. Aye. She stretched herself, groaning, and shook her skirts, which were thick with foxtails by now, and Jamie could feel the prick of them through his stockings. Dozens of tiny needles. The thought of Jenny going was a dirk right through his heart. It hurt to breathe. He knew, she could tell, and she didn't look at him, but coiled up the pearl rosary neatly and, taking his hand, dropped it in his palm. Keep it for me, she said matter-of-factly. And if I dinna come back, give it to Mandy when she's old enough. Jenny, he said softly. See, when you come to wrecking your life, she said briskly, stooping to pick up the goat's rope, you see that it's the bairns are most important. They carry your blood. They carry whatever else she gave to them on to the time ahead. Mandy's the furthest out. As far as I can reach, the youngest girl of Mam's blood. Let her take it on then. He swallowed hard. I will, he said, and closed his hands over the beads, warm from his sister's touch, warm with her prayers. I swear, sister. Well, I can that, Clotheed, she said, smiling up at him. Come and help me catch these goats. It was so good. I had to read that whole section. It was so good. So let's take a minute to talk about this doom foreshadowing vibe that's happening here, especially with Jenny. If we remember, everybody calm down. If we remember, Diana said the book was a snake and that it would have it's coming, but you don't know when, how, why, who for, by who, And so if you notice, I'm noticing this now that we're almost halfway through this, we're just about the halfway point of this book. Diana is creating this very ominous tone now for multiple characters. We have seen this kind of a tone that sounds like something's about to happen to this character. We've seen it for William, with John dreaming of his death, of him in a grave, of him, all this stuff. We've seen it with Bree, with her heart, and the talk that she could have a stroke, and the talk that she could die. We've seen it with Hal, with his asthma and stress. We've seen it with Jamie, not with the Frank book. It's going to be coming. We haven't seen it yet, but that's coming. And we saw it with John in the end of the last book, foreshadowing his death. I got a bad vibe about Percy, that Percy might be in trouble in that last chapter with John, even though it wasn't necessarily death. I get a sense that he's in trouble with whoever he's working with, and he wants to get the hell out because it could be the end of him. And so I kind of get that feeling. And now we have Ian, Rachel, and Jenny heading on this dangerous journey. And Jenny was remember, before this book came out, Jenny was a high favorite, as was Hal, to die in this book. People were putting their money that we were going to lose Jenny, or Hal. That was kind of what people thought. And of course, Diana read all those comments. She knows that while she was writing that this is what's in the fans' mind. And so I think she's playing into that a little bit here. And I think she's being a little too heavy-handed with it for it to be the real danger. Diana is not that bold with it. I believe now that I've read this, that Jenny is a misdirection, that she doesn't want us to detect where things are coming from in this book. She wants to have that vibe like it's sneaking up on you. You don't know where it's coming from, but you're getting a sense from all over there's danger. And so a misdirection is a way to that end. And so it kind of felt like overkill with Jenny, so I'm not buying it. I'm putting my bets that we have Jenny at the end of this book, that she's still alive and kicking. So those are my summary and thoughts. My favorite storyline in this section was the Jamie and Claire storyline, I think. And my favorite chapter was 58, Telling the Beads, which I like that. I just realized how that is very euphonic to Telling the Bees, But anyway, it was a masterpiece of writing with a very tight second place of chapter 54, Moonrise, which is kind of like a 1A, 1B for me. Very strong chapters for each of these two characters. On the writing, the strengths, I thought it was very strong writing through these chapters with a very clear focus on characters and relationships and revealing secrets and deepening bonds. These were very immersive chapters, especially in 54 and 58. Especially well done is the transition work from chapter to chapter. It created this very smooth flow through these chapters. You don't feel jolted. One thing I have seen big time in this book so far, especially in this section, is something different than recapping. Diana is going back through the series and layering in more tapestry to the past. She's giving you a different POV of something, more explanation or information through a different person, another impression. She's explaining motivations for things or thoughts behind actions of the past, why something happened on the page. And so now some of these are things that I have seen her asked off page, and then her giving an explanation for it. And then, people would scoff at those things, like the Frank thing or different things. They would scoff and say that the author's explanations are not part of the canon of the story, which is technically true, but still, I always listen to the author's intent and take that into consideration. You get that whole, it's extra textual. And so you see her putting those explanations into text by showing these old things and putting a new spin or added information into these past events. It's very appropriate to do this, I think, as the series is winding down. We're in the penultimate book of the series, to give you these extra details on past events. And at the same time, we see her clearly seeding her future works. We've already seen it for the next Lord John novel, and talking all about the Black Chamber stuff and the stuff that's seen with Percy. And now we're seeing it with some of the prequel, what we might see in some of the prequel in this last chapter. Maybe even some questions that'll be answered in the Master Raymond book about what happened at that faith, with that whole faith thing. We'll see Master Raymond's POV of that. So all of this is really wonderful craft by Diana. On the weaknesses, there wasn't much weakness except for there was a long stretch here with no Grace, no Willie, still no Donnie, no Denny, no Firstly. I feel like a halfway point. I would like to have seen those other characters we haven't seen yet. The times also feel a little wonky, a little in this section. We're nearly at the halfway point. I kind of want to see things crank up now into what we're dealing with. I mean, we've seen it a little, but it's not cranked up the way it should be, I think, at the halfway point. By the way, we still, to my knowledge, have not seen this mystery sixth side of the honeycomb. Have we? I haven't seen anything that's a six-side mystery story. So I don't know when we're seeing this. I mean, we're at the halfway point, so maybe it'll come out in section 4. So I'm going to go and end this take with one more piece of QB Hive feedback. This one's from Ellen Sullivan. Ellen, I took a couple little lines out just to try to shorten this up a smidge, just to let you know. What an incredible section of this book. My good is that Bree finally was able to open up to Roger and tell him about her condition. It would have been better if she had told him earlier, but at least she finally got her heart issue out in the open. Bree and Roger have come a long way in their communication skills with each other over time. It's not perfect, but much improved. Also, Roger needs to know if she's experienced symptoms, especially going on this long trip with Jemmy and Mandy. My second good is Jamie is finally able to start recalling what happened at the Battle of Culloden. Such a terribly sad scene. My bad is the foreboding of illness and death that is apparent in this section. First, Bree experiencing dizziness, palpitations, shortness of breath. How terrifying to be having these symptoms on a long trip into the wilderness. Thankfully, Claire sent Bree off with ways to handle her condition, but what if her cardiac problem gets worse? You can't help but feel she is so at risk for having a devastating event happen. Chapter 58 also leaves the reader with concerns for Jenny. She states that she may not make it back from her trip to New York. She is not young anymore, and the trip is into the wilderness and dangerous. There are animals that could attack, unfriendly Indians, increasingly cold weather, and an accident could happen. When Jenny hands her rosary beads to Jamie to give to Mandy, it was a sign of the foreboding Jenny feels about not making it back to the ridge. My great was Claire coming into her power by being able to revive the twin baby girl. The spirit of faith seems to be connected to Claire's increasing healing powers. When she asked Jamie, "What color is my hair?" Jamie replied, "It's all colors," indicating to accomplish more she needs to reach her full healing power strength. Great comment, Ellen. I agree with all. But like I said, I do think the foreboding with Jenny is a piece of misdirection. Maybe though something does happen, but I don't think she's going to die. And I think Diana is laying touches of foreboding everywhere to, like I said, make the reader have no idea who's getting hit. But on hindsight, when we look at it, we'll see the little pieces in there for the one that does, And we've also seen, like I said, foreboding on a few. But Jenny was one that was being forecast. So I think she's really messing with people on that one. On the all the colors line, I think the key there is all around your face is the color of moonlight. In other words, white. And meaning that her newest hair, the roots around her face, the hair now growing in is white. And that's how I took it. But great comment. Thanks. A lot of great thoughts there for sure. So let me know your thoughts on these 9 chapters. Which was your favorite and why? What else stood out, both in the section of chapters and this post that I've said? Our next first take will be on chapters 59 to 69. I'm reading it today. Hope to get that post up sometime this weekend, likely Sunday. And before we go, I want to real quick meet another spotlight bee. Yes, I want to definitely get these in because I'm doing less posts, so I definitely want to get my spotlights in. There was 3 that I still needed to introduce from last month. This person has been such an encouragement and a confidence booster for me. I really appreciate that so much, especially early on in this whole thing, back when I started the book club. I wondered if anybody would really care what I thought, who the hell am I? And so she really would boost my confidence with like random thoughts and comments to me like, "You're the best teacher I ever had, and I wish you were there when I was in college," and things like this. And I'd laugh it off, but inside, it gave me some faith in myself when I felt kind of on shaky ground in the earlier days of the book club. And even starting this page, she signed up here as a Craig Nadoon patron. As soon as I started, she said, "Glad you did this. You're worth every penny." And at the time, I really needed to hear that because I was a bit uncomfortable taking this step at first. And I'm talking about my friend Lori Siderman from North Carolina. I think God put Lori in my life as a wee encouraging little angel flitting over my shoulder, I always tell her that I think she's my biggest fan. She would soak in my comments on posts and deep dives and blogs and leave detailed, engaging comments. Lori was an English professor herself for 30 years and has been an Outlander fan since the first book came out in 1991. So coming from her background and her Outlander knowledge, her wee boosts have meant a great deal to me. She's retired now, enjoying time with her hubby Mark. Lori's very involved in several literature sites, and she works as a beta reader for a few literary sites. She's a very smart cookie. So thanks so much, Lori, for always being such a supportive friend and a vital part of our hive. That's all for now, my bees. Don't forget to like the post and leave a comment. Also, please share the page with a friend, please, and help our little hive grow. I could really use the help. So see you soon. Mwah.